Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Jason Anthoine. Jason is an executive advisor focused on employee engagement, internal communications, and culture change. A frequent conference keynoter and presenter, webinar leader, and podcast guest, Jason has shared his internal communications and corporate culture insights earned over his 35-year career with thousands of like-minded communication and HR leaders looking for a better way. In this conversation, we dive into tips for communicating with all employees. But what I think is most interesting is this conversation that we have around blue collar, working class, or even just distributed employees. So think healthcare, think even salespeople who are maybe distributed all over the country. How do we reach people who are hard to reach? How do we humanize the communications? How do we know who we're communicating to so that we can target our messages in a better way? All of these are things that we talk about, and Jason has some really, really great insights into humanizing communications so that they can be more impactful. And if our communications are more impactful, our business is going to be better, our people are going to be happier. A lot of great things fall out of improved communication. That's true in all areas of life. So excited to share this one with you. I really think there's a ton in here for people. Here is Jason Anthoine. Jason, welcome to the show. It has been fun getting to know you pre-show. We were just laughing a little bit and sharing some stories. Yeah. So I was like, wait, we gotta carry this energy into the episode. So excited to have you on and dive into your expertise today.
Well, thanks so much, O'Brien. It's great to be here. Like you said, we were having such a great chat. We should just turn it on and keep that energy going. But I'm excited to be here and look forward to having a lot of insightful nuggets to share and hearing what you have to say as well. So it should be fun.
I look forward to it. Well, let's start at the beginning here. Could you share whatever you think is relevant of your kind of origin story and background and how you came to be doing the work that you're doing today?
Yeah. I'll try to make it brief. When I have an open mic, you never know what might happen. So
we got time.
Yeah. So I grew up in a very small town in middle Georgia called Fort Valley. And Fort Valley is kind of known for two things. One, we grow all the peaches in Georgia, so it's Peach County. And then the other thing is Bluebird school buses. So if you rode a Bluebird school bus growing up, likely It was made in my hometown. And my dad worked there for 37 years as a production line foreman. And my mother was a secretary at the bank. This was so long ago that you could call people secretary and it would be fine. And so they would come home from work and just talk about work and what happened and what they liked and who was great to work with and who wasn't. And, probably like most parents do. And most kids are like, who cares about any of that stuff? But for some reason, I found all that fascinating. When I went to college, I was like, well, I don't know what kind of job that might be, but that sounds like public relations. So that was my major in college. And then I graduated from the University of Georgia on a Saturday and moved to Atlanta on a Sunday. And on Monday, started doing the employee newsletter for a bank. And that was 35 years ago. And I have spent the entire time doing internal comms and employee experience and culture change. I've been responsible for external comms at different jobs along the way, but I would always try to hire really good people who love external comms and let them do that because I don't really care about that. I really care about internal comms and culture and employee perspective about things. And so that's what's most thrilling and most interesting to me. And, you hear people say, oh, well, it's not really work if you love what you do. And I'm one of those people, like, this doesn't feel like work to me. Like every single aspect of this is absolutely fascinating. And it ought to be. We spend so much time at work. It should matter and people should feel good about it. So what can I do to help make that a better experience?
That's fantastic. What was it about the internal communications versus the external communications that really caught you?
I think for me, and I don't know about everybody, but for me specifically, I like it because on the external side, if let's say, for example, you send out a press release and say, oh, hammers are on sale at the Home Depot, and here's how great they are and the company that made them. I don't know if anybody bought a hammer because they saw that or not. Like I could see, all right, if this thing went to 50,000 publications and got 40 million views, I don't know if anybody bought a hammer because I did that or not. But on the internal side, if I put together some sort of communication for the senior leaders or the CEO, or we have a great town hall or whatever that might be on the inside of the house, I can see a direct line between I helped make this happen and then here's what people did as a result. All we're trying to do is making sure that people are informed and involved and inspired so that, everyone's kind of pulling in the same direction. So I can see exactly the result and very, very quickly of what I'm doing in that area and how that's having an impact. It's very hard to see that on the external comm side. And so that's why I prefer it. Every day feels like a scoreboard. There's an opportunity to throw a bomb and run a reverse and score a touchdown. And I like watching that scoreboard because that scoreboard is what matters most to that business. So and maybe I'm the only one that feels that way, but it just feels easier to see the impact of what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great when you can find something that you're really passionate about, whatever that thing is. And I think sometimes we're embarrassed to say the things that we're passionate about because there's a thing in society where if you get geeked up around something that other people don't get geeked up around, you're a geek or a nerd. Right. And that's a bad thing. And I have so many hobbies that I get hopped up about that aren't outside the norm that I've had those labels for a long time. But I think that's really what makes life fun, right? Is finding something that you really are passionate about.
Yeah. And I think too, forever, all of us in business, particularly in HR, we've always talked about sort of work-life balance. And to me, if you find what you're doing and you're really passionate about it, you don't have to separate them. There is no work. There is no life with a gap between them. There is just work life. And the goal for me is the blending of those things. And that to me tells me that I'm in the right area because I don't think of it as work and I can't not think about work when I'm not at work. And so all that's blended together. And to me, that's just a special place to be when you can find that in your career.
Yeah. So speaking of blending, you've kind of blended your whole life into your career. You talk a lot about your father and his work on the assembly line or overseeing the assembly line. Yeah. And a lot of your work, as I understand it over the years and today, is focused on more of the working class worker and reaching those folks. Why did that resonate so much from your childhood? How did you decide to focus so much of your work there?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think it's because, I just kind of grew up in a blue collar town and had a blue collar kind of childhood. Like I said, most of the work around Fort Valley is either agricultural or industrial. And so it was just, that was all I knew. And so, there wasn't a big 80-story skyscraper full of accountants and lawyers. What is that? I don't even know what that means. And so it turned my own blood kind of blue to match that blue collar kind of an upbringing. And I think I've spent most of my career, whether working directly for companies or with them on the consulting side, most of those companies have been for industries that have distributed employees. Sometimes, they're thought of as blue collar, especially in manufacturing, but that same thing applies for healthcare or retail, or let's say you do have an accounting firm and you've got a bunch of offices all over. They can be thought of as distributed employees like that. And the idea is that the further away they are from where the action is happening, the more important it is to connect them to that, and also the harder it is. And so I've just spent a lot of time understanding why and how and the best ways to do that. And it just helps me, I think, be a better advisor for these companies that have that particular type of situation. Not everybody does, and that's fine, but I'm just really jazzed up about helping people figure those things out because their work matters just as much as anyone else's.
What do you see as the biggest differences in reaching and communicating to a blue collar workforce versus a white collar workforce? I think there's a lot of stereotypes that we all have in our head. We talk about the difference, but we're also all people at some level. So what do you see are the differences in reaching those folks and what they want and how they want it versus a white collar? And what's the same? Like where can we just say like, hey, these actually aren't differences?
Yeah. I think on the blue collar side, in any organization, it kind of falls into those two categories like you just described. And so the white collar people, in air quotes, are responsible for making all these promises in the marketplace. And then once they do, it's usually the blue collar people who are responsible for keeping all of those promises in the workplace. Right? And so sometimes they're not talking and they're over promising and they're not checking to make sure, hey, can we actually do this? Because I said we could. And so I think, there's a symbiotic relationship there that most people understand and grasp. And that's how it works here. But I think the disconnect comes when trying to reach those blue collar employees, because it is harder. And because it's harder, most organizations go, they'll get it. It's too hard to try to reach them. So we're not even really going to try. And so then they say, the local leaders or the production line foreman or the plant manager or whoever it might be, the hospital administrator, whatever, they're responsible for doing that and they'll do it. They hardly ever do because they have a day job and they don't know how to do it. And they have other things that they're responsible for. And so the idea that, they'll just pick it up because that's part of what happens out there, wherever out there might be, without truly sort of understanding what happens out there and then making that a coordinated effort. And so you end up with an organization, particularly on the blue collar side, where, like we were talking about before we turned the mic on, they're responsible for running all the plays on the football field, but nobody's told them the plays. Nobody's put up a scoreboard to help them understand where we are while we're playing this game. And they haven't spent a whole lot of time, understanding the why behind any of that. And so that's usually what I see most often is it's too hard to reach them, and therefore we're not even really going to try. And maybe I'll give you a pass on those things. It's not really that true. But the things that we do have in common is that the white collar employees need exactly the same thing. It's just easier to reach them. So, you want to know the score and you want to know the plays and you want to know why we're doing all this stuff? Great. It's on Teams, it's on Slack, it's on an intranet, it's on digital signage. You talk about it, on Zoom calls and all that kind of stuff. So it's easier to reach those people. And so that's why they usually get a bigger helping of that kind of information than the others do, which means that humans are humans. Both groups need the same types of things to understand what they're doing and, more importantly, why they're doing it and how that all fits into how we're trying to get somewhere. But just because it's harder to reach those other folks doesn't mean you should try. And lately, there's just so many different ways to do that makes it less hard. So I think the excuse of, it's just hard to do it, it's kind of starting to wear out. It's been long worn out for the people in the blue collar area. They're tired of hearing that, and now digital tools and a bunch of other ways you can do things. There's just no excuse not to anymore, I think. So
let's unpack that. I've got like 5 or 6 questions on how we actually do that. So what are the best ways? Well, let me back up. First question is, what I think I hear you saying is transparency about business and performance and expectations.
Yeah.
Here's how the business is performing. We're up, we're down. Here's what we need to do. Here's what we need the second half of the year to look like, all that kind of stuff.
And transparency is the word. People confuse that sometimes with honesty. Like, we don't have to bare all of the books and talk about everything that's happening, some of which we're not prepared to talk about yet. But what we want is a culture that when it is time to talk about those things, we will. And so that usually is the first stumbling block, which is, okay, if we say we're going to be open in our communications, then when somebody asks a difficult question we're not ready to answer yet, what are we going to do? Well, the answer is we ourselves don't know the answer to that yet. But when we figure that out, that's when we're going to tell all of y'all. So I think that causes a lot of the challenges from the get-go, which is there's an expectation of I work here, the more I know, the better work I can produce, and the more productive we all can be, and the more successful we'll all be. But then the company tends to be, for a lot of different reasons, reluctant to take advantage of that offering from the employees of tell me everything. I'm an adult. We can figure things out as we go along. There's always this sort of reticence to go, well, we can't tell them all that stuff. Well, why not? I mean, you're asking them to do things to fix whatever those things are. We need to know what those things are to be able to do that. So it's just, there's always that rub, and I never have understood that. Like, you want to be more open. We're all on the same team. We're all trying to get to the same place. And the more everybody knows, the more everybody can contribute to helping us get there.
Yeah. I might step on a landmine here, but that's okay. There's an element in these types of workforces where it's more likely that they could be unionized, right? Mm-hmm. Blue collar, yes. Healthcare, those types of things. There's more opportunity for unionization. And if I can stereotype unionization, it can create a us versus them dynamic on both sides, right? The management can look at the union and say, okay, this is going to be adversarial. The union, the employees in the union can look at the leadership and say, well, we need to go take what's ours from them and make sure that they're treating us fairly. And so it can create adversarial relationships.
Agreed.
How do you see blending what you just said with that type of environment? And like, what are some best practices for trying to bridge that gap in this transparency communication?
Yeah, I love that term you used, us versus them. And, sometimes that's exactly how to describe that situation, particularly when there's, a union that's the third person in the bed, so to speak. Yeah. And so, but the reality is that us versus them tends to be the undercurrent all the time, whether there's a union there or not, because, corporate's different, salaried people are different. They get these things, we get this thing. Most of the time it feels out of whack. And so that us versus them thing is always kind of the undercurrent there for a lot of different reasons. But particularly when there's, a union that comes into the conversation, they're typically there because employees have finally gotten to the point where we don't trust the company anymore. So when a union shows up, it's because trust is broken. And trust shows up in all of those things you just listed, compensation policies or benefits or vacation or time off or seniority or whatever those things might be. Those are the tangible things that make up trust. And so employees are interested in somebody else coming in and fighting that battle for them when that trust is broken. So every single thing that you do as part of your culture and employee experience, and certainly about communications, is about putting deposits into that trust bank. We're going to be more open in the town hall, and we're going to talk about, the tough quarter we just had and likely the tough quarter we're about to have and what we need to do about it. That kind of transparency puts a deposit in the trust bank. Oh, we said we're going to get back with you after we did the employee engagement survey. Here's all the things that you said, good and bad, and here they all are. That's another deposit in the trust bank. So every single thing that you're doing, whether it's comms or, leadership, kinds of things, or culture or employee spirit, they're all deposits in that trust bank, because there are going to be checks you have to write against that sometimes, some of them that you know of, and sometimes the transmission on the car goes out and it's an unexpected withdrawal that you're going to have to make, and you've got to make sure that, that thing doesn't go overdrawn. And so the more we can focus on building trust, because that's all it is in any organization, humans working together with humans, and trust is the bond between them. What can we do to make sure that we're building that and putting all those deposits in there so that when we have to make withdrawals, it doesn't overdraw the account?
Yeah, I love that analogy.
And the other thing, too, I think another important point is that I think companies are like, we're going to have to make a withdrawal. Employees understand that. they're adults, they're humans. Like, this is just how business is. If we had something else, we'd probably if we all won the lottery, there wouldn't be any businesses, right? We wouldn't. This is just the reality of how business works. And I think companies think employees don't really understand that, but they understand it way more than most companies think they do. And yes, sometimes when things are good, then they'll be better. And sometimes when things are not good, things will get a little bit worse. I think they understand that. And so they're not afraid when withdrawals have to be made. They're just afraid that you're not going to tell me far enough advance when I might need to worry about a withdrawal being made, and it'll surprise me. And that gets back to kind of the trust and the openness and the transparency. So most companies are reluctant to be that transparent because they don't think employees will get it, but they get it more than you think they do, and they understand how business operates. And deposits are great and withdrawals are inevitable. So let's just talk about them all the time.
Yeah. It is amazing what happens when you treat people as peers versus subordinates or not smart enough to understand something or, not interested in understanding something that's going on that affects them.
Exactly. And, when they're not at work, they're running their houses, whether they live alone or have a spouse or family or whatever their situation might be. Their personal life runs exactly the way every other business does on this planet. And so their deposit is their paycheck. Their withdrawals are their utility bills, or the transmission went out, or we're saving to go to Disney World, or whatever it might be. Everything that they're doing in their personal lives to run their personal lives is exactly the way a business operates. So if you are running a business and you don't think employees understand that, then you must have a bunch of people at home doing all those things for you, because they're doing those things themselves. They're their own little CEO of their own little company, and it's called home. And of course they understand how business operates because that's how they operate. So let's just start from that starting point.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. All right, so let's talk about how we do this. I work with a lot of companies that have these kinds of distributed workforces, and we're trying to help them solve some communication challenges with what we do.
Yeah, sure.
You got 5, 10, 15 locations. You've got 2, maybe even 3 shifts going on. Healthcare that, they're working around the clock, weekends potentially, in that setting, especially. They don't have computers that they're sitting down to every day. Mm-hmm. They maybe have a smartphone. Well, probably have a smartphone. How are we reaching these people effectively today? What are the best companies doing that's really making a difference in getting them connected to their people?
Yeah. Well, before the pandemic, but certainly since the pandemic, the default has been high tech. Oh, we're having a hard time reaching folks. And now they're working from the house instead of in this big building we paid money for. So we're going to give them all kinds of tools, Teams and Slack and email and, just a long list of things for the white collar folks who are digitally connected like that. You don't have the same kind of luxury for the folks who are not digitally connected like that as part of their jobs. And they also, quite frankly, didn't have the luxury of being able to work from home. My dad couldn't build a bus in our den. You have to go where the buses are being built to build buses. So They didn't have that luxury, and that also added to the, us versus them kind of conversation. But despite all of those options, and some of which are great, and they're all sort of situational and culture kind of based, there is zero substitute for face-to-face and or other types of human-based communications like that. So it is always more valuable if you are working in, a healthcare environment where none of your teams, doctors, nurses, support staff, whatever, are digitally connected to a device 24/7 the entire time they are there. What is the most valuable thing you can do is actually meet and talk with people in person as much as you can. The luxury of having people in those kind of, quote, blue-collar jobs is that they are where the work is. They're not doing it remotely. So you have the most powerful thing in communications in your arsenal for those groups, which is face-to-face communications. It is everything else that we've come up with since then, email, apps, Zoom calls, all this sort of stuff is a substitute for that. Because when it gets right down to it, that's the best way to communicate, and that's the way most people want to be communicated with. And so that's the advantage that distributed workforces have, is that built in to how the work gets done is face-to-face, which is the most trusted and most essential and efficient way to communicate with people. Having said that, it still doesn't happen. We're like, oh, how are we going to get everybody together? We've got all these shifts and we got to get buses out the door, and somebody's got to keep doing that while we're over here having this town hall meeting. Yep. That means you might have to have 2 or 3 or 4, one for each shift and one for people who aren't on shift. Or maybe you bring them in early before shift change, or maybe you keep them late after shift change, and you have to pay them for that. So if all that stuff's important, if all these KPIs and building trust and all that's important, then you have to invest in that to make that happen.
I think that's great. And I would love for every company to be able to do that. But a mid-market company or a larger mid-market company,
mm-hmm.
like, who's the one out delivering that message? Because let's say you've got 10 or 15 different sites,
mm-hmm.
even 5 different sites with
Sure.
2 different shifts. If you're having the CEO out on the road all the time,
mm-hmm.
then they're not maybe doing the things that they need to be doing in the business. And then you've got HR that has to go around, and then you've got others
Sure.
that have to go around. So, like, who's out doing those actual communications, and what do you see for companies that start to get bigger, start to get
Sure.
more distributed?
Sure.
How are they segmenting those or structuring those so that they're not just doing a 365-day roadshow?
Sure. It starts with the understanding that communication is a leadership responsibility and not a department down the hall. And so all those people you just named, the CEO, the CHRO, the plant manager, the shift leader, the head nurse, on the floor over the night shift, all of those people are leaders in your organization, and all of them play a role in communicating. And to me, it breaks down kind of into 2 buckets. Big C communications, which is from corporate, from the CEO, from the top down through the organization, which in most organizations, regardless of the size, is about 10% of the communications going on there. And you really don't want it to be more than that. Otherwise, people think it's just a bunch of fluff and propaganda. So 10% is kind of the big C, which means the other 90% is little c, which is every other kind of communication that goes on in the organization, most of which is collaboration and teamwork and leaders working with employees, and a lot of it is face-to-face. So when we think about the example you just said, there's a company and they've got 5 plants distributed all over, and the CEO can't go to all of them all the time and do it all himself. No, absolutely not. And that's not what you want. Because then it just says, all right, this whole place is being run by one person, and whatever it is they say is the most important thing, which discounts the role that every other leader needs to be playing in the organization. So it has to be the right combination of things. So from a big C perspective, these executives and leaders are going to say and do these things on this kind of schedule from a big C perspective. And then we expect our other leaders, these plant managers, the hospital administrator, the nurses that are responsible for the third shift at 2 a.m, they have to play these roles during these times and on this schedule, so that everything that's being heard is complementary no matter who's saying it, but not everybody has to do everything because they can't. And the more local that communication is happening, the more powerful it is, because the CEO can come in and do the town hall, and then, for a week before the CEO gets there, we got to clean behind the refrigerator and dress up the place so that he or she thinks this is what it looks like all the time. And we've all seen that happen and know what a ridiculous exercise that is. Yeah. And then CEO does whatever, and the CEO goes away. Well, here's what happens. CEO goes away, everything returns to normal, and we need to know what we need to be doing because of what the CEO just said. And it's the local leaders who are responsible for that. So it's just like anything else. Everything is local. So CEO and headquarters or whoever might be setting the strategy, but it all gets implemented locally. So that little c is what's even more important than the big C in most organizations. Yeah. And fortunately, that can be done by the local leaders who are usually the most trusted anyway.
It just occurred to me as you were saying that and tell me if this is right or wrong, but one of the things, if I'm reading into what you're saying, is a good senior leader is actually pushing the message down to the lowest possible deliverer of that message. And then what they're really doing is coming in and reinforcing the messages that are then being communicated by those people down below, rather than then coming in with the message and having everybody below them reinforce that message. They're pushing that message down and having it delivered as low as possible. And then they're just coming in and reinforcing the message.
Yes. That's exactly right. And the way I like to think about it is little C is mostly the ground war, and big C is the air support, and air support's great. We can do some things from that perspective when we need to, but the thing gets won, right there on the ground. And it's those local leaders who are best to do that. And by the way, they're usually the most trusted and the most believable. And so thank goodness, because they got to carry a lot of that weight, and the big C folks just kind of help coordinate it, but they're going to help, really reinforce that to the people that they know personally.
Yeah. So many business analogies can go back to sports.
Sure.
I played lacrosse growing up, was one of the sports that I played.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know a lot of people aren't familiar with lacrosse and how it works, but there's 10 people on the field at a time, right? You've got 3 sort of offensemen, 3 defensemen, and 3 what's called midfielders who play both offense and defense. And then you've got a goalie.
Sure.
And there's only one ball that's moving around. So you got 20 people on the field, one ball moving around. And at any point you've got 12 or 14 people in the offensive zone, playing either offense or defense at the same time. And so there's a ton of commotion happening.
Yeah.
And our coaches would always get on us if we were quiet, right? You've got the coach on the sideline barking in the big strategic commands, or you call a timeout, you go over and he'll draw something up. But then you've got the players on the field calling out the plays, calling out backup, and a defenseman. You would always say, I've got ball, if you were on the ball. And then there would be somebody else who would say, I've got 2, meaning that if your guy got by you, they would back you up. And then they would say, I got 2, or I'm the slide. And then if that happened, they would say slide. And then you'd have to know, like, there'd have to be 3 or 4 people who would all back up, or there'd be an open guy and they'd score the ball. I know that's confusing, but the whole point of that is there was a ton of chatter going on the field all the time. And the best teams were the best coordinated. And so every time the ball moved or the person with the ball changed position, they had to be re-coordinating everything that was going on. And so there's just all this chatter going back and forth on the field all the time.
Yeah.
And the best performers were the ones communicating the most. And that was just what I was like picturing in my head when you were explaining the big C, little C, lots of communication happening all the time.
Sure. And I love that analogy because, whether you play sports or not, usually you're at least aware of them. And, so we always have to be careful with sports analogies. But I think it's a really good one because think about what you just described. So there's a ton of action going on the field. And think of all the inputs and data points that you're getting real time. Sight, sound, sometimes feel, like that's a lot of different kinds of data coming in. It's just, think about it, by the end of the game, what's that, 1 million points of data maybe? I don't know. It's a ton, which is no different than the business, which is why I'm just not a huge fan of like the old timey way of doing performance reviews. Once a year, I'm going to hear about what I did 9 months ago, or town halls, quite frankly, because the way most of them are conducted, once a month, once a quarter, somebody comes in and looks in the rearview mirror. Here's how we did. And we spend a whole lot of time talking about that, looking in the rearview mirror instead of spending that time looking out the front windshield. And the way you avoid that is everybody conducts a town hall every day. Here's how we're doing versus how we're supposed to be doing. Here's what we need to be doing better. These are the things you got to cover over here. All right. I got 2, like all the things you just said, all the the more often that goes on and the more real time it is, just like with the lacrosse team, you're probably going to end up doing better, because if you're waiting until the end of the week, or the end of the month, or the end of the quarter of all things, that's not relevant. That's not real time. That I can't make it. I can't fix what happened in this quarter if I don't hear what happened until the end of that quarter. I need to hear what's happening the minute that I'm doing it. So the more of that you can do, formal and informal, certainly the better.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I like to just, the way I process this is like through
same thing. I
stories
grew
and
up playing
analogies.
football and running track and all those things too. So it's easy for me to think that way as well.
Yeah. All right. So we've been talking about how to get our message to employees, but it's important also, I know from our prep conversations, to understand the message from employees, to actually go out and understand who our people are, what makes them tick, what's going on in their day-to-day lives. Why is that so important, first of all? And then what are great companies doing to get that information?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes back to sort of the very definition of communication, which is it doesn't really take place until someone communicates something and then someone receives that communication. And I think a lot of organizations forget that, oh, well, we sent out that email. Well, sure you did. That doesn't mean anybody read it. Half those people were on vacation, and some people have a rule that says when this kind of email comes in, it goes into the junk thing because I don't even want to look at that stuff anymore. So you think you've communicated, but you haven't, And so it's especially true the further away from the action that your employees are. And that's, distributed employees and manufacturing and all the examples we just gave. It's hard to reach those folks, but when you take the time to do that, that's when you end up making the difference in doing it. But you make a lot of assumptions in that. All right, I'm going to send it this way, and they are going to receive it that way. And hopefully they don't have any questions, because if they do, there's not really any way that we have in place that allows them to even ask those, much less getting the answers. So how are you able to communicate to a group of folks who are responsible for helping you keep all these promises if you don't even really understand them? And sometimes people go, well, I don't even really know what that means. That's exactly what's happening in marketing. There's nobody in marketing who has ever gone to the senior leaders and said, we're going to take out this ad campaign and it's going to be the best thing we've ever done. Okay, great. Who are we targeting? We don't know. Just people who buy stuff. Like if they got money, we got something to sell. Like that's ridiculous. Nobody thinks that way. This is the exact same discipline, which companies already are very good at. You just take that knowledge and apply it to your employees. So we need to understand who they are and what they need. And people on the second shift are different from people on the third shift, and people who are 75 years old, if they're still working out there, are different than people who are 23 years old. Some are more comfortable with digital stuff. Some are not. We've stopped mailing stuff to the house. Why? They have a mailbox. They have a family that like to know what's going on. So the more we know about our employees, the more relevant and targeted our messages can be. And the only way to really know that is to ask them. I can't tell you the number of times I've worked at organizations where HR will send out, an email and probably, some kind of direct mail to the home, usually around benefits or something like that. And it's like, dear employee, like, what do you mean? I've been working here for 27 years. You don't even know the worst piece of junk mail I get says, dear Jason. Like, how do we not know who our employees are? We know everything about our customers. She's female. She drives a Volvo. She has 2.3 kids. She has 1 dog and 2.5 cats. Like, we have that level of detail about our customers because we have to, because we think about them that way. Our employees are no different. So the more we can know who they truly are and what their preferences are, the easier it is to build that relationship with them, particularly when it comes to communications. And if you think, well, we don't know that, how are we going to find that out? Just go ask them. Just go ask them. It's that simple. Like, build out some extra columns in all of your HRIS systems to put that kind of data so that you can begin to understand who those employees are in a different way.
When you say go ask them,
yeah.
So there are a couple different ways you can ask them. There's engagement surveys, there's pulse surveys, there's focus groups, there's just anecdotally walking the floor. Hey, what's going on? What's important to you? What are we doing well? What are we not? is the answer just yes? Do all of it, or
it can be formal
how do we
and
organize
informal.
all that? Okay.
So if I'm running a plant, for example, and I've got 500 employees, I want to know everybody by name. I want to know if they have spouses. I want to know their kids' names. I want to know what they do when they're not there, because the more I understand them when they're not at work, makes it easier to build communications and trust and relationship with them when they are at work. It doesn't start getting into the creepy area of marketing where, they're listening to my phone even though it's not on, and now they're serving me up ads that I don't like that. That feels
weird. They know I'm pregnant before I do. That kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's not that. You don't want to go that far. That's too far.
Yeah.
But we have to go further than where we are now. And the people who have the most opportunity to do that are the ones who are around them the most often. And you can keep that stuff formally in the HRIS system, or you can just keep a little notebook in your pocket and just refer to that whenever you need to. But I just can't imagine that. Again, it just comes back to trust. It is hard to trust somebody if you don't know them and they don't know you. And so the more you can do that, the more likely trust will occur. And the more you can think about them the same way you think about your customers, and the more you know about them, the better things can be. Your employees are no different.
Yeah, that's so true. We have CRM systems for all of our clients and prospects. We don't have them for our employees.
No, listen, when I worked at Newell Brands, I was a CCO for Newell Brands, and, we had all the latest, HRIS and all this other stuff. And we rolled out an employee mobile app. And the first phase was for obviously wired employees because they're easier to get to. And then the second phase was going to be for non-wired employees. And wired was, 10 or 12,000, and non-wired was about 40,000. With the idea being we'll be able to reach everybody if we want to, and they'll be able to get information that they need when they want to by using this mobile app. And so I was like, okay, that's great. But at a certain point, we're going to be pushing out a lot of stuff, and people are going, I don't know that this is relevant for me, and I don't know why I'm getting it. So I'm not going to look at that anymore. And then over time, I'm not going to look at anything anymore. So we're going to spend all this money to be able to reach them, and so that we can push a whole bunch of stuff that is usually irrelevant for the majority of the people. So I was like, all right, well, before we get to that point, we need to understand who our employees are. Let me go to HR. I'm sure they've got all this data in the HRIS system. No, we don't. What kind of question is this? This is ridiculous. All right, I'm going to do my own. So we just built our own database. We took the HRIS data, stuck it in another database, and then added 10 or 12 fields to it so that then we could be really targeted, very specific. Like for the example I used with HR at the time was, give me a list of the women who've just come back from maternity leave who had their third child. What? Are you kidding? How are we going to do that? It's like, you know who they are. They're using your benefits to have this kid. Like, you know who they are. You know they just came back. They're on the payroll. Like, you know them, but none of that is in a common database. It's all spread out everywhere, and nobody thinks of their employees that way. So I was like, that's the example that I'm trying to get to. So that's what we were building. I want to know who's on the third shift in this state, who is or is not married, so that I can talk about, what our benefits are if you are going to get married. And that might be 50 people. I don't need to send an email to 50,000 people. I just want to talk to those 50 people. But HR doesn't know who they are, so I need to know who they are. So we built all that, and then finally, and we were able to do all that targeting, and then finally HR came over and said, can we have your list? That looks like it would be really helpful. It looks like it would be really helpful. And I'm like, sure, I'm glad to do it. I mean, I understand the politics and silos and all that stuff you have to put up with in corporate life, but it helps everybody. It helps everybody. So, let's not worry about who owns it and who's responsible for it. What can we do to make things better, and then share that with everybody who could possibly benefit from it?
So this is going to be really in the weeds, but I think this is, if somebody is struggling with this, I think it could be helpful. So
yeah,
I love building the database. My memory sucks, and I cannot hold things in my head for very long. There's too much going on. I'm bouncing between thing to thing. So years and years and years ago, I just started keeping lists of everything. I keep a list of people I know who are looking for jobs, of jobs I know that are open. I keep a list of all the companies and people I meet. I've even kept a list of friends, just to make sure I'm not missing anybody, right? Like, who are all my friends? which
That's
sounds
fine.
so dumb, but
no, it doesn't. Like this phone that I carry around, if something happened to that, I wouldn't ever go to a meeting. I wouldn't know anybody's phone number. Like it is my other brain. People like us have to have that. There's too much now to keep in your brain.
Yeah. So I'm a believer in the church of writing it down and keeping a database. But how do we translate that into the targeted communications? Mm-hmm. Like, do we need some kind of app that just is easy to then automate? Because it can get really tedious if we have to search 1,000 people every time and come up with the 100 or 300 or whatever, and then put them into emails. And then it can just become really, really tedious. So what's the best way to keep this personal and to, like you said, going out to individuals is the best, but we can't do that all the time with these types of communications. So what's the best way to actually make this as simple as possible for the people who are trying to get the message out?
Yeah. Well, obviously, technology is your friend. Usually the people who are trying to communicate are the ones who do have access to technology on a daily basis. And so what you just described and what the example I just gave at Newell Brands is make a list, have as much detail as you can, so that when it is time to communicate something, usually the default is, all right, we're having this change. It only affects these people, but because we don't know how to get to just them, we have to tell everybody and hope that we don't make them mad in the process because there's only 50 people that this really matters to. If we know who those people are and those 50 people and why it matters to them, then we can communicate directly to them. And so what we need to do is understand who they are. All right, now we have a list. This list is called whatever the reason we're communicating with them, so that next time when we need to send them something else related to that, we already have a list. The challenge that comes up is that, there's a lot of data and a lot of systems inside the organization, but not everybody has access to it. Certainly, we don't want everybody to be able to send an all-company email to 150,000 people globally. Like I sit here in Georgia, it doesn't matter if there are donuts in the break room in Kenya to me. Like that, we can't give everybody the ability to be able to do that. But what we need to be able to do is for people to be able to go in there, see that data in such a way so that they can build their own distribution list to do their own communications themselves. And it has to be digital for the people who are sending it, which means they're going to have to do a little bit of extra legwork to find out more about those employees. But if you go to those employees and say, if you will share this data, these data points about you with me, then I can guarantee you that I will send you less stuff that you don't care about. There's not one person on the planet who won't sign up for that. So people are usually very willing to give you that type of information to make their experience better. So once you get it, keep it where people can access it pretty broadly so that anybody who needs to communicate with them has access to the same information.
Yeah, I love that. Give us this information so we can send you less. Usually it's the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Hey, give us this so we can send you all this more better stuff.
That's right.
And it's like, no.
Check out at some retail store. Let me have your email address. Absolutely not.
Yeah, no,
I don't ever want to hear from you again. When this runs out, I'll come right back here and I'll buy it again. And between now and then, you don't have to remind me.
Yep.
So employees feel the same way. I'm not going to give you that. You're just going to bother me. Oh, you're going to bother me less? Yeah, here it is. Here's everything you want. If you promise to do that,
you just leave me alone.
You ask me anything. That's you, and that's really true. Like there's a bunch of employees that they live to work and work to live. Like there's two different groups, and so the work to live. I'm going to come in. I'm going to do a great job. You tell me what to do. I'm going to do it. And then when I'm done, I'm done. And I don't want to hear about this other stuff. I'm not coming to the town hall. If something's important, somebody that I trust will tell me. Other than that, I'm here to do my job. Others are different, and that's fine. But that's the whole point of this entire segment we're talking about is we have to understand that. Not everybody is the same. Not everybody is going to be 98% engaged all the time.
Yep.
Some people are only 20% engaged for a lot of different reasons, but they're 100% effective. Do we just disregard them? Absolutely not. But we also don't want to bother them so much that they don't want to do anything for us ever again.
Yeah. So let's talk about these spreadsheets or these databases just a little bit more, because I think people who've never done this, it can be daunting, right? And I know this because, like I said, I'm somebody who uses these databases and has for a long time, and I will show people what my process is and all the databases I have, and you can just see them start to panic and get red in the face and go like, yeah, there's no way I could ever do that. I'm like, well, no, I built these one at a time, and they've all been updated over time. So how do you suggest people start? And you mentioned like, yeah, let's add 10 to 15 different columns with different categories of information. Mm-hmm. What are the types of categories that allow people to do this in a meaningful way? Like if you had to suggest a couple categories, what would those be?
Yeah. Well, first of all, start with what you already have. So you collect all that stuff, when people are being onboarded and throughout the employee life cycle. So whatever it is you're doing now start there. Don't like throw it all out and say, we have to start over. Start with what you already have. And then as communication needs come up over time, new categories will make themselves obvious. So for example, if you want to communicate with salespeople who, quite frankly, are distributed employees because they hardly ever sit still. They're all usually always all over everywhere all the time. If you want to be able to communicate with them and understand, how to reach them, then you can't just tie their work location to where their boss sits and the building they're supposed to be in because they're never there. Their work location is wherever it is they are. And so we need to be able to keep track of those things. So how do we know if, O'Brien is sitting in Cincinnati or he's going to be, in St. Louis or now he's out in Seattle? So we can start to learn that stuff about you because we can see IP address from where you are emailing from. We can see your expense reports and where you've traveled to. And so there are things that we can start to do to kind of paint a profile of O'Brien and how the things we might do to be able to reach you because of how you do your job. But that's on the sophisticated kind of end. On the simple end is just basic things like home or personal email address. And people are like, well, what do we need that for? Most distributed employees don't have a company email address. Or if they do, they're expected to check it at a kiosk on their break, which they ain't never going to do because they're on a break. Why would I check email while I'm not supposed to be working? So understanding what their home email address is important because there are times when you might want to reach the spouse who's normally responsible for making benefits decisions, and this is the best way to reach somebody who doesn't work there. What is their mobile phone number? Oh, well, I don't want anybody calling me when I'm at work. No, you don't, but you probably like to know if we're shut down for snow or there's an active shooter situation. Like, we need to be able to get in touch with you sometimes immediately. This is not something we're going to abuse, but to have that information will help us help you in different ways. So it just starts with some basic things like that. And then as other situations kind of arise, it will be obvious. Oh, this is another data point that might be interesting to know. Like, oh, this person was working in this plant on this shift, and now they've been, promoted, and they're 5 miles away at our other warehouse facility now, and they've also changed shifts. That'd be helpful to know. And sometimes that data doesn't get tracked or it's very lagging in the HRIS system. I've been doing this job for 5 years and it still says I report over here, I'm on this second shift. Like, all that stuff has to be as fresh and as current as possible. Yeah. And usually it lags because who's responsible for doing that? Best person responsible for doing that is that person. Hey, I'm over here now. Let me update my own damn record. Yeah. We don't have to have an army of people coming in here to update all this information. Let the people update.
Yeah. Well, and I like your comment too around letting the need unfold over time, because I have gotten into trouble doing this early on. I learned this lesson quickly, which is don't try to boil the ocean all at the same time, because it winds up getting so complex and sophisticated that it doesn't become usable anymore. And so I think part of keeping these databases is thinking about the ways to keep them as simple as possible. And the way you do that is by letting it sort of build itself over time. That's what I always suggest to people, because we talk a lot about process. I'm in a sales role. We talk about process and the funnel and all of that kind of stuff. And people who come in without much of a process often balk at the idea of putting new process in place because they think it means we have to throw everything out and start again. And the thing that I always suggest is just pick your biggest leak right now. Are you leaking energy? Are you leaking leads? Are you are you not following up with people you've met? Like where's the business getting away from you? Or what are the communication challenges that you're just like, man, if we could only solve this one next, it would make life a lot easier. And then just go solve that one. And then get that going in a way that works really, really well. And then figure out what the next one is that you need to solve and go solve that one, get that up and running, just do one at a time. And over the course of 2 years, 3 years, you've made a lot of progress.
Yeah. And that's absolutely right. And I think the other thing is that, we've been talking a lot about sort of these high tech and digital kind of solutions that help us deliver these high touch kinds of experiences. But it doesn't have to be high tech. If you're the plant manager and there are 300 people out there, you don't have to open up a spreadsheet or buy some CRM system or ask for access to HRIS. Every time you walk around out there and talk with people, come back when you're done, sit down, take out a little notebook and said, O'Brien said this, Jason said that, Sally said this, so that the next time you walk back out there, you can follow up on those things. And then when you're done, you come back and you jot your notes down. And before you go out again, you look at your notes. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. We all need, different ways to sort of have these supplemental things to help us with stuff that we can't keep in our brains all the time. It doesn't have to be high tech. It needs to be something. And even something as simple as that will help. Yeah.
It was funny because I used to do a lot analog. I'm a note taker. And so I would take all my notes by hand. And then it was only when that became the problem. Like my biggest problem was if I wasn't in the office or didn't think, if I was leaving the office and wasn't going to be back for 2 or 3 days and I had to think about all the files I had to bring with me, I was like, this isn't sustainable anymore. So then I solved that problem by digitizing that information. And now I have a remarkable notepad, which I use for a bunch of different stuff, and I bring my notes with me. But that's not where it started. It started with analog. And it was only when analog became a problem that I went digital.
Yeah. And I think a lot of companies, particularly the comms people, we all like technology and whatever it is that makes our job easier. But sometimes that's not even needed. Think back. There is a business world before a computer was invented, and it was successful for decades. Like carbon copies got put in a tube and sent across the bank using air. Yeah. Like if you say that to somebody these days, they're like, "What are you talking about? Medieval times?" Like there are things that were appropriate. They're still just as appropriate, whether they're digital or analog or not. And so, we worked with a client over the last 5 or 7 years, and they were a storage facility, and they were buying a competitor storage facility, and the competitor storage facility wasn't advanced as they were. So they had 150 locations. They didn't really have email. Like they might have calls they would get on, but they didn't really use email. So there was no way to communicate to that group that, hey, here's what's going on. But what they did have was fax machines. So we said, all right, if that's what you got, that's what we're going to use. So every Wednesday at noon Eastern, we're going to send a fax with the latest update. And you know what happened? Wednesday at noon, there were people in the storage facilities standing around the fax machine waiting to know what was going on. That was the channel that they had. That was the channel we had to use. So, there's a lot of conversation about all these channels and look how cool this is or whatever. Channels aren't really the thing. It's the content that matters the most. They'll crowd around an intranet. They'll crowd around a bulletin board. And they'll crowd around a fax machine. So reach them how you can reach them. And you don't have to spend a bunch of money on the fanciest latest
Just make
thing
it good.
To be effective. Just make it good. It's the content that they care about. And if it's relevant and timely and very appropriate for them, you can't go wrong no matter how you deliver it.
You waste their time with that fax, they'll never. That's right. They'll never look at it again.
It. Yeah, they'll be like, "Oh, there's nothing but crap coming in on this thing. We're going to throw it out in the yard."
Yeah, it does. It does take a lot of intentionality to understand how to craft a good message, and it is, it is tough to be, especially if you're an HR person who has so much compliance related processes and information
all the time.
You have
all the time.
All these fires that come up. And you have to recruit people and onboard them. And there's all these procedures that need to happen. And then you also need to be an expert in marketing. And you also have to be an expert in storytelling. And you also have to be and I think this is true beyond HR. I think this is just true of the modern world today, where we all have to have these human skill sets on how to storytell and communicate and listen and store information and use information and make it relevant. Like all of these people skills are so relevant, and it requires us to do more than just whatever our thing is these days.
Yeah. And I think you just had an important point there when you said you have to be an expert in all this stuff. And I think that's what the marketing people want us to feel about all these things that, these tools are trying to sell us so that we can be experts at stuff. But when it comes to this communication stuff, you don't have to be an expert. You just have to be a human. How would I want to be communicated with? What makes me want to trust somebody? What do I need to be able to do my job? And then project that onto others and let them tell you if yes, no, maybe about whether that's right or not, and then do it that way. You don't have to be, a liberal arts major that's might one day win a Pulitzer Prize. You just have to put some words together and help people understand what we're doing and where we're going. You don't have to understand PowerPoint. You don't have to use all these videos. You don't have to do any of that stuff if you don't want to and aren't comfortable with it. All you have to do really is to want to do it.
Yeah.
The how you do it will get figured out, and the fact that you want to do it is what will be appreciated the most.
Yeah, that question, would I like this? Would I read this? Would I find this relevant or interesting? That is an important question. I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah, it is. And it's important. And so, and the second part of that is, would they?
Yeah.
And the only way for you to really understand that is to know who the they are. And if you're not spending the time like we just talked about of understanding who the they are, then you will put yourself in there as the they, and it will be fantastic for you, but not for them.
Jason, we are about at time here, and I'm looking through my...
Feels like we could go for several more hours. I don't know if anybody would listen that long, but you and I can certainly talk that long.
I think we've come to a great spot here, because I'm looking at about half the questions that I had written down I didn't ask you, but I think you've covered, and which is always the best way to do these conversations.
Good.
But I think just the messages of personalizing these communications, understanding and knowing your people, building trust, like these are all just great lessons that we can all use on any team that we lead. I mean, I think it's as important if you're leading your family team as it is leading your office team. So
exactly.
Yeah. Is there anything that we didn't hit that you're like, oh, here's one other thing that would be really helpful for the audience?
I think a couple of areas. I think one, and just real quick, like people are like, oh, well, corporate communications is this. And so everything we need to do needs to kind of be whatever we think that standard is. Listen, the more you can take the corporate out of your corporate communications, the better. The simpler, the better. Somebody who's not, a trained writer, let them write it, the better. Because the more the company sounds like a human, the more the humans relate to it. And as soon as the communications start to sound like a lawyer wrote them, nobody has time for that, and they don't even understand it anyway. So just because you're not trained, that's an advantage. It makes you more human. It makes the company sound more human. And that's a great starting place for trust. So I wouldn't worry I don't even know what an AP style book is. It doesn't matter. You just say what you would say it the way you would say it if somebody asked you, and that's good enough.
That's good enough.
Yeah.
Jason, thank you for coming on the show today. This has been a spectacular conversation. And anybody who is interested in more conversations with Jason, all of his contact information will be listed in the show notes. And we encourage you to reach out, because this is what he does professionally. And he helps companies just like yours and leaders just like you. So, Jason, thank you again for coming on.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Gosh, what a great conversation. And I'm just so glad we had it. And if there's anybody that needs any help, I sell communications for a living. That doesn't mean the meter's running. You got a question. You're running through a sticky situation. Call me, email me. Let's talk through it. Like
two humans.
Exactly. Just like two humans. Think your car's not working, and stop by the mechanics. You can go, oh yeah, you just need to put this here. That's fine. He's not going to charge you for that. That's what he does for a living. He's glad to do it, and so am I.
Fantastic. Well, best of luck to everybody out there. Good luck connecting and communicating. Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.